First, that he denied giving state papers to Whittaker Chambers. Second, that he denied knowing him. His testimony, similar to that given in Washington, led to the grand jury indictment. Here he faces Chambers, denies that he knows him as Whittaker Chambers, denies that he ever had any dealings with him before the war, takes the stand to testify to this.
To the best of my knowledge, I never heard of Whittaker Chambers until in 1947, when two representatives of the Federal Bureau of Investigation asked me if I knew him and various other people, some of whom I knew and some of whom I did not know.
Released in bail, he will stand trial in January.
It was 1945, and a woman named Elizabeth Bentley walked into the FBI's office. She had a big secret to share. Elizabeth was born into a good family in New England. She went to a good school called Vassar and graduated with a smile and a curious mind. After Vassar, Elizabeth went to the University of Florence in Italy to study. While she was there, she liked the ideas of a man named Mussolini. He was a powerful leader in Italy, and his words made her excited. But when she came back to the United States, she changed her mind. She started studying at Columbia University and joined the Communist Party. Elizabeth liked being part of the Communist Party. She went to meetings and dinners with her new friends. They had a lot of fun together, but she needed a job to support herself. In 1938, she found work as a secretary at the Italian Library of Information. It was close to her apartment, and she thought it would be a good job. However, Elizabeth soon realized that the library was not what it seemed. They were spreading ideas that supported fascism, which was the opposite of what she believed in. She wanted to tell her friends in the Communist Party about it, but they didn't seem to care. They told her there were more important things to worry about. Elizabeth didn't give up. She kept pushing her friends to let her investigate the library. Finally, they introduced her to a man named Jacob Golos. He was a spy from Russia, and he was interested in Elizabeth's idea. Golos taught Elizabeth how to spy, and she started listening in on conversations and looking through her boss's trash. As Elizabeth worked with Golos, she started to like him. At first, she thought he was just an ordinary man, but as they spent more time together, she saw him in a different way. She thought he was strong and handsome. They started a romantic relationship, and Elizabeth became Golos's courier. She helped him with his spy work, and they worked together for several years. But in 1945, Elizabeth decided to stop working with Golos. She went to the FBI and told them everything she knew. She gave them the names of over 100 Russian spies who were working in the United States. The newspapers called her the Red Queen, and her story became famous. Elizabeth's decision to work with the FBI was a big surprise to everyone. She had been a part of the Communist Party and had worked with Russian spies for many years. But in the end, she decided to cooperate with the government and tell them everything she knew.
Расскажите о начале вашей преступной деятельности. В ноябре 1960 года я решил войти в контакт с американской разведкой, для чего я подготовил письмо, в котором высказал эту свою просьбу и желание начать со мной работу.
It was the year 1961. The Cold War was at its peak. The United States and the Soviet Union were like two enemies, always watching each other. In the Soviet Union, there was a man named Oleg Penkovsky. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet military. Penkovsky was born in 1919, and he had a big secret: he was a spy. Penkovsky worked with a man named Greville Wynne. Wynne was a British businessman who traveled to Eastern Europe a lot. The British intelligence agency MI6 asked Wynne to help them.
First question the president asked was, how long before they can fire those missiles? And Art Landau said, well, Mr. Graybeal is the missile expert, so it turned to me. I stood up behind the president, McNamara and Rusk, and for the next probably 5 to 10 minutes, that fired one question after the other. In answer to the president's question, how long can they fire these missiles, I relied primarily on the combination of intelligence sources, but mainly Penkovsky's information, which told us how these missiles operated in the field.
They wanted him to carry secret information from the Soviet Union back to London. Wynne agreed, and he became a kind of messenger or courier For MI6, Penkovsky and Wynne met in secret. Penkovsky would give Wynne documents, photos, and information about the Soviet military. This information was very valuable to the United States and Britain. They wanted to know what the Soviet Union was planning, especially when it came to nuclear weapons. In 1962, the Soviet Union started building missile bases in Cuba. This was very close to the United States, and it made the Americans very nervous. The United States and the Soviet Union were on the brink of a nuclear war. This was known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Penkovsky was supposed to be a key player in stopping this war. He was supposed to be giving the Americans and British important information about the Soviet Union's plans. But some people, like Benjamin Fischer, a historian who used to work for the CIA, are not so sure. Fischer says that Penkovsky may not have known as much as people thought. He may have even given false information, which could have made the situation worse. Fischer studied Penkovsky's case and found some interesting things. He said that Penkovsky did give the Americans some useful information, but it was not as important as people thought. For example, Penkovsky gave them a manual for a Soviet missile, the SS-4. But this was not a big secret, and it did not help the Americans that much. Penkovsky also gave the Americans information about the Soviet Military Intelligence Agency, the GRU. This was useful, but it was not enough to stop a nuclear war. Fischer says that Penkovsky was not as close to the Soviet leaders as people thought. He did not know about their plans for Cuba, and he could not stop the missile crisis. The story of Penkovsky and Wynne is a complex one. It is a story of spies, secrets, and nuclear war. It is a story that is still being studied by historians today. It was June 1941, and the Nazis had just launched a big attack on the Soviet Union. This attack was called Operation Barbarossa. The Nazis were very successful at first, and they took over many cities in the western part of the Soviet Union. They even got close to Moscow, the capital city. The Soviet leader, Stalin, was very worried. He thought about leaving Moscow, but then he decided to stay and fight. He put a new commander, Georgy Zhukov, in charge of defending the city. Zhukov had a plan to fight back, but he needed more soldiers. The problem was that many of the Soviet Union's best soldiers were stationed in the Far East, near Japan. The Soviets were afraid that Japan might attack them, so they kept their soldiers there to protect the border. But Zhukov needed those soldiers to defend Moscow. That's when a man named Richard Sorge sent some important information. Sorge was a German communist who had been living in Tokyo, Japan, for almost 10 years. He was pretending to be a Nazi, so he could get close to the Japanese leaders and find out what they were planning. Sorge sent a message to Stalin saying that the Japanese were not planning to attack the Soviet Union. This was very important news because it meant that the Soviets could move their soldiers from the Far East to Moscow. And that's what they did. In the autumn of 1941, the Soviets moved 400,000 soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and 1,000 planes to the Western Front. These soldiers were trained to fight in the winter, and they were very good at it. They surprised the German army and pushed them back from Moscow. This was a big turning point in the war. The Nazis had been winning for a long time, but now they were starting to lose. And it was all thanks to the information that Richard Sorge had sent. Sorge had been spying for the Soviets, and his information had helped them make a very important decision. 2 years before, in 1939, the Nazis had been very successful. They had taken over many cities in Europe, including Warsaw, Brussels, and Copenhagen. They had even gotten as far as Paris, and Hitler had posed for a photo in front of the Eiffel Tower. But now, in 1941, the tide of the war was starting to turn. The Soviets were fighting back, and the Nazis were starting to lose.
Mr. Harold Philby, on the right, holds a press conference to deny charges that he was involved in the disappearance of Burgess and McLean.
Mr. Philby, Mr. McMillan, the Foreign Secretary, said there was no evidence that you were the so-called third man who allegedly tipped off Burgess and McLean. Are you satisfied with that clearance that he gave you?
Yes, I am.
Well, if there was a third man, were you in fact the third man?
No, I was not.
It was the 1930s, and many students at Cambridge University were interested in communism. The Soviet Union saw an opportunity and recruited about 40 students to be spies. These students, including Harold Kiem, Philby, Donald MacLean, and Guy Burgess, were part of a group called the Communist International. They wanted to unite communists from around the world, but really they were working to promote the Soviet brand of communism. Kim Philby, also known as Kim, after a character in a Kipling story, attended Cambridge from 1929 to 1933. He studied history and then economics. At Cambridge, he became friends with Maclean and Burgess, and they all shared an interest in Marxism. After they graduated, they were recruited by the Soviets to spy on the US and Britain. The job was to learn about counterspionage, or how the US and Britain caught spies. In 1933, Philby married a communist named Alice Litzy Friedman in Vienna. They traveled to Spain, where Philby worked as a reporter for the London Times, covering the Spanish Civil War. He pretended to be a fascist, but by 1939, he had to leave Litzy behind because her communist connections could have been discovered. After the Spanish Civil War, Philby got a job in the British Secret Intelligence Service. He worked in the Counterintelligence Division, which he called the heart of the secret world. Philby rose quickly through the ranks and became a trusted agent. But what his bosses didn't know was that he was also working for the Soviets. For almost 8 years, he acted as a mole, passing information to the Soviets. In 1945, Philby received the Order of the British Empire for his work during the war. 4 years later, he was sent to Washington, D.C. as the British intelligence liaison to the CIA and FBI. This was a very important job, and he would have access to information about most US intelligence operations. Maclean and Burgess also worked at the British Embassy in the US. One day, a codebreaker in Washington told Philby about some decrypted cables known as the Venona decrypt operation. One of the messages mentioned a Soviet agent named Homer, who worked at the British Embassy in Washington from 1944 to 1945. Philby knew that Homer was actually his friend Maclean. He warned the Soviets that Maclean might be discovered soon. He also told Burgess and Maclean that they should defect to the Soviet Union to avoid being caught. To protect himself, Philby sent a message to the British Secret Intelligence Service, reminding them about 2 Soviet defectors who had previously mentioned a mole in the British government. Aldrich Ames was a CIA official who worked with the Soviet Union and Russia. He was arrested in 1994 for spying. Ames told the Soviets about many secret CIA operations. He gave them information about tunnels with special listening devices near Moscow's space facility. He also told them about a device that counted nuclear warheads on Soviet missiles. Ames started spying in 1985. He spoke Russian and was in charge of the CIA's Soviet Counterintelligence Division. At first, he sold the identities of 2 KGB double agents who worked at the Soviet embassy in Washington. These 2 agents were working for the United States, but Ames told the Soviets about them. They were executed along with 10 other Russians he betrayed. In 1986, the CIA started looking for a mole within the agency. They knew someone was giving away secrets, but they didn't know who. Ames was able to hide his activities for several years. The CIA thought 2 other people might be the mole, but they were wrong. Between 1986 and 1991, 3 more double agents disappeared. The CIA still didn't know who the mole was. In 1991, they asked the FBI for help. The FBI started a big investigation called Night Mover. They made a list of 20 suspects, and Ames was on the list. But when they gave him a lie detector test, he passed. The FBI wanted to watch Ames more closely. They suggested moving him to a different division within the CIA, so Ames was transferred to a counter-narcotics division. But he was still able to spy for the Soviets. The FBI was watching him though. They tapped his phone and put cameras and bugs in his house and computer. The bugs in his house helped the FBI learn more about Ames. They found out he had lied about a vacation in 1992. He said he was going to Colombia, but he actually met with a Russian agent in Caracas, Venezuela. The FBI caught him on camera during this meeting. The FBI wanted to catch Ames in the act of spying, so they waited to arrest him. They finally arrested him on February 1994. He was about to go to Moscow on CIA business, but he never made it. When Ames was asked why he spied, he said it was because of greed. He wanted to make extra money, and he got about $2.7 million from the Soviets. Ames is now in prison for life. He will never be able to leave.